And now to end the program, we have a fantastic and interesting keynote speaker. And to introduce our speaker, I first will introduce Jack Querter, who is an attorney in our Minneapolis office. Jack?
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everybody. I'm Jack Querter, an attorney in Minneapolis and a member of the Food, Beverage, and Agribusiness Industry Group at the firm. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Heitkamp. I know Senator Heitkamp because I formerly worked on her staff and was a member of her first staff when she was elected to the 112th Congress. On her staff, I assisted her with her work on agriculture and transportation policy and advised her work in particular on the Senate Agriculture Committee. When I joined Senator Heitkamp's staff, it was both an incredibly exciting and challenging time for farm policy. Congress had failed for the prior 2 years to pass a farm bill, which under normal circumstances is legislation that Congress considers every 5 years. And it's the most important piece of legislation for rural America and the farm economy because it authorizes our food, agriculture, conservation, rural economic development, and nutrition assistance programs. When Senator Heitkamp was running for Senate, she made clear that her #1 priority for North Dakota was to pass a farm bill because she recognized its importance to her state. And so Senator Heitkamp sought and was granted a seat on the Senate Agriculture Committee. And from day one in the Senate, she was focused on the critical work of the farm bill. She dove into this work with passion and gusto and had an outsized impact on the 2014 Farm Bill. She played a role in shaping our farm safety net policies. She played a very significant role in shaping that legislation's policies that impacted conservation compliance, and also had a leadership role in shaping our crop insurance programs, especially as they relate to prevent plant. So today, many of these policies are operating in rural America and impacting the farm economy as a result of Senator Heitkamp's good work. And the reason she had success in this area is because she was a product of rural America and understood the importance of these policies. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce my former boss, Senator Heidi Heitkamp.
Thanks so much, Jack. You know, when we go back and take a look at kind of farm bills and farm policies, I think that we always hyper focus when we're talking about the rural economy on the farm economy. There's a reason for that. In states like North Dakota, 91% of all of our entire land mass is engaged in production agriculture. And even though in rural America, we have jobs that are in light and interesting manufacturing, we have a lot of service-related jobs, whether it is daycare, education, mining and extraction is a big part of the rural economy. And certainly the largest single employer is healthcare. And we can talk about what that means, but I think any of us who grew up in a town of 90 people, and yes, I was in the town, I was not a farmer, but my dad drove bulk gas out to farmers. I mean, we understood that if our town was going to do well, if all the businesses in town were going to do well, if the post office was going to stay open, the farm economy needed to be successful. And so I really want to focus today on the actual farm economy. And I don't know, Jack, if you want to go ahead and start the slide. I don't know how that's going to work. There you go. And so I want to start with this slide. And you may say, why? I mean, we know this. We know that the large scale farms, over 1 million, produce about 50% of all the food that is produced in farms. And if you look at the small, less than $350,000 in gross farmer income, that's about 90% of all farms, but it produces about 21% of all of our agricultural products. And why do I show you this? Because right now the vulnerability, not just because of COVID, but because of low commodity prices and because of concentration, whether it is in animal agriculture, whether it is actually taking a look at crop production. If you look at concentration, who are the most likely to be the low-hanging fruit that are going to exit the farm market? And I think it's clear it's those mid-size and small farmers that are going to have tougher times managing severe economic stress. And when you lose a farmer, you have the potential of losing a whole lot of other businesses in the community. And so when you look at agriculture, agriculture used to be a huge component of America's GDP. You know, all of that great land that we expanded westward and produced. But bottom line is, per acre, it wasn't very productive. We had a lot of farmers farming a lot of acres, probably, you know, when you look at the 40s, probably what we're doing today. But we have had this massive increase in productivity, and you can see it here. Total farm inputs compared to total agricultural outputs. That's the product of better pesticides, better herbicides, better seed, you know, larger equipment, more sophisticated equipment. Certainly the technological revolution has not bypassed American agriculture, but it may in fact have created additional stress on these small farms kind of going forward. And so agricultural productivity is a great American success story because it has enabled us to expand and to feed the world. But when we have things like pandemics and COVID, all of a sudden we see a lot of crops still in the bin, a lot of unused agricultural output. I was intrigued by the earlier discussion about the numbers of people who are, you know, about food waste, because when you look at this, clearly, the more productive we are, the more likely it is that we're going to have to find international markets. And there's no secret that the international market that we cultivated over a long years in Asia has been disrupted by the president's interest in pursuing a different trade relationship with China in particular, but backing out of what I would say was a huge mistake out of TPP, you know, ignoring TTIP. We have really jeopardized and allowed our competitors in countries like Brazil and Argentina to get market share. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so what does that look like? I dare say that when I was a kid, those very many years ago, you would not have seen the level of soybeans that you see here. Corn was obviously a cash crop for a lot of years, but as you see, as we have developed international markets for these products, we have seen this huge transition away from some other traditional products like barley, oats, and even wheat. Wheat used to be king in my state. Now it's corn and soybeans, the largest cash crop. But when you look at soybeans and you think about how people use soybeans and who uses soybeans, you realize certainly for us in North Dakota, where 90% of our market goes out the Pacific Rim, this has been devastating to lose the soybean market. And, you know, we'll see whether Asia begins to repurchase, in particular, whether China fulfills its commitment under phase one. One chart, and I think you saw it probably earlier in the earlier presentations, would tell you that, man, we are a long way from meeting those commitments. So the next chart. And this is a busy chart, but I think it's important, and to the extent I know I wasn't able to get into the packet because I no longer have staff, so now I have to do this stuff myself. And I'm a very famous procrastinator, and so it took me a while to pull this together, but I love this slide because it tells you what it costs to produce a crop per acre. And when you look at this and you think about where the crop prices are today, and you think about how critically important it is to get those prices up, but the stress that farmers are feeling right now, you might think, oh, it's about COVID, it's about markets, and yes, but the stress farmers feel right now is getting a crop off the field. And because if they aren't able to get 200 bushel corn or 60 bushel soybeans, their margins are, they're going to be devastated with these inputs because those inputs don't change with a hailstorm. That's what you have into it, and that's why the farm program is so critically important. But you know, if we can share these with anyone later on, I think you will see when you tally this up, the very thin margin. And the other point that I want to make is when you look at, and the previous speaker was talking about return on investment, the worst return on investment in America today is agriculture. That's always been true. And you may say, well, why is it that we still have people who invest millions of dollars in crop and inputs that don't ever see a 10 or 8% return on investment? I think in part it's a way of life, and that kind of mystique of the agrarian myth, I don't know that we can count on that being kind of a value into the future. And that's why when I showed you the first slide of the number of small farmers, those small farmers have the ability to lease their land, and you'll see some of the lease costs in this chart, have the ability to lease their land and actually make a living, and probably a more profitable living than if they're actually farming. And as we concentrate farms into fewer and fewer, there's incredible consequences for the rural economy, but equal consequences for political ramifications of fewer and fewer farmers. The next slide. So I think one of the things that I want to say that we have we have to be thinking about is re-examining the resilience of the current crop insurance-based farm program. Man, when I came to Congress, it was 2013, absolutely great farm prices, and everybody was saying, okay, we no longer need this farm safety net. We've achieved this level of efficiency. We've done all these things that we need to do. Crop prices are wonderful. We found markets for the corn, whether it is in corn syrup or whether it is in fact in ethanol, international markets, and we're on our way with the growing middle class globally. We're well positioned to not really need anything other than that guarantee that we might get from crop insurance. This is probably one of the kind of places where critics will in fact meet and cross ideological lines. And I just want to make this point, even in spite of this pandemic and struggling farmers, Heritage Foundation has released a report saying stop all farm subsidies. It's highly economically inefficient. It's not a conservative value. And as a lot of you know, the Environmental Working Group has been working for a lot of years to basically take down the farm program, mainly by exposing largesse of the large farmers getting huge government payouts. There's a whole lot of ammunition both sides are going to get as a result of the pandemic. If we can see the next slide. And if you were in the earlier program, you know the economist from USDA had this chart, and I put this chart in here for two reasons. Number one, to take a look at kind of this what's traditionally called the flyover area of our country, and you see that is the places that have in fact received the most amount of market facilitation payments. These are the payments that Trump has distributed, not because of any congressional mandate, because he used the CCC, which ironically is an old New Deal program, to make these distributions. A lot of critics on both sides of the aisle say these were economic payoffs to retain rural support in many of these communities that you see, whether it's Wisconsin and Michigan, North and South Dakota, certainly Nebraska and Kansas, getting a huge part of these payments. If I can have the next chart. And then now you see the COVID payments and how they're distributed across the board. When you look at a state like North Dakota with a population of under 1 million, and you see, 105 compared to California at 263. I want you to think about that in the context of an evaluation that is sure to come as a result of these payments, retroactive review of whether we did the right thing in terms of the CARES Act, whether we're going to do the right thing in terms of restoring our rural economy going forward. But I also want you to think about this in the context of the next slide, which is the political waning of American agriculture. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the last two charts, and again, I want to point out that the small percentage of small family farmers, those are all voters. Once those get consolidated into larger units, there are fewer and fewer people whose livelihoods are dependent on agriculture in rural America, and they may be certain one-party voters, but there's going to be few of them, and they're going to be concentrated in the Midwest and in areas that don't have the same high level of political representation that a lot of folks have on the East and on the West. If you can give me the next chart. This is interesting to me too, because this is from the Farm Bureau, but basically using ERS data. And you say, what percentage of our overall GDP, when you look historically, agriculture's been a huge part of it. And certainly farm-based agriculture has been a huge part of it. And if you look here, the small percentage, the farm share of agricultural GDP. So farmers, even in this small cohort, farmers are less of a percentage of GDP in their own category. And then if you realize that right now, productivity coming off the farm in American economic analysis, it's only 1% of our overall GDP. And so when we look at what drives the American economy, and consequently what drives the political reaction to it, this is a pretty significant piece of data. And so if you look at related industries, $1 trillion, the output of American farms contributed 132.8 billion of that sum, which is 1% of overall GDP. And so again, contracting, not that the agriculture share of GDP contracting will also have a political consequence in terms of how people react and how Congress reacts to making huge amounts of dollar investment. I can have the next chart. So transitions and COVID-19. So you asked me to think about and talk about how COVID-19 has changed the economy of rural America. And if you look at where we are right now and what happened with the supply chain. I know I wasn't able to participate or listen in on the previous discussion, but when you look at supply chain, we had been built to supply hot lunch programs. We had been built to supply restaurants. We had been built to supply workplace cafeterias. All of that went away in COVID. And now all of a sudden we saw empty shelves. We saw, I think a lack of resiliency in some ways, and people can argue with me about that, but a lack of resiliency in some ways when people started eating from home and going to grocery stores. And so that supply chain now is starting to catch up, but not completely. And I think the question that American agriculture and certainly policymakers and big thinkers at USDA and at our land grant colleges are going to have to kind of think about is how do we, in a time of kind of change, what do we anticipate is going to happen in terms of permanent behavior changes? You know, there's in sociology, there's a lot of discussion about how long does it take to form a habit. You know, if you're going to exercise every day, how long do you have to do it, and for what period of time before it becomes part of a routine and part of your habit system? And I think we are now at that point of 90 days where eating from home, cooking from home will have a permanent, certainly midterm permanent result or consequence on what happens with restaurants, what happens with other kinds of available systems for food. You see Papa John's exploding. You see anyone who's in the delivery of food business exploding, and actually thinking, look, we don't need to open up storefronts. We just need to be providing this opportunity for getting food into people's hands at their home. And so I asked a Harvard economist this. I was fortunate enough to listen into a program. He was talking about the fact that the service industry obviously hit the hardest in terms of employment, and no one really knows how is that going to come back. Are gyms going to come back? Are restaurants going to come back? And then how long will it take before they reach early 2020 changes? And agriculture, and certainly the food industry and the supply industry, is going to have to respond to that. I asked this question, and I'm not being facetious. Will sugar become the new tobacco? I will tell you, as the Attorney General of North Dakota, I actually helped litigate and negotiate the tobacco settlement. And when you look at kind of what the thinking is about sugar, about the high concentration of sugar in processed foods, I think that there's more and more being written. In fact, Scientific America ran a headline story that said, is sugar, you know, toxic? Well, at certain levels it is, and certainly in our diet, it is becoming more and more awareness about how much of it is in our diet, and whether that is in fact leading to some of the challenges that America is having right now with COVID and with the lack of resiliency among our population, especially if the population has hypertension, diabetes, high rates of chronic condition that are preventable by better diet and exercise. Eating more plant-based protein. I didn't think that piece of meat that they showed earlier was very attractive, but I have been able to kind of follow the progress of Impossible Foods and understand that a lot of our plant-based proteins are now transitioning and finding their way into a different kind of diet, whether it's chickpeas, whether it is lentils, whether it's edible peas. I mean, we're going to see more and more discussion. And I think having an interesting discussion about what happens with protein replacements in hot lunch programs and in food security issues that the government is involved in. Eating organic or non-GMO. The non-GMO stuff kind of drives me crazy because you know, I was on the forefront of the labeling dispute as Vermont was requiring non-GMO labels, and the industry, that the agricultural commodity groups and the farm groups were sitting back saying, look, you know, all that productivity that you just experienced, that I just showed you the earlier chart, all that productivity may in fact be isolated. You know, it may in fact wane as a result of the non-GMO movement, and there's never been any proof. But the reminder that I would always give our producers is, look, you know, you got to produce for your market. You've got to understand where your consumers are, and you only have two choices. Number one, convince them that GMO products are equally safe to anything else that they would buy, or start growing to the market. And so the GMO debate is not gone. It is going to continue. And again, this is an interesting right-left argument. You have a lot of the folks who are in what I call the anti-vaxxer movement, the more conservative movements that you see basically in discussions today about what's happening with COVID. They are the ones running the co-op stores and the organic food aisles. They have joined with maybe people more on the left. The other big movement is farm to table, and I don't know, if this is niche or if this is something that you're going to see more permanency to. One of my big fights was country of origin labeling. I'm a big believer that consumers have a right to know where their food comes from. And when we were challenged in the WTO by Canada and Mexico and lost that challenge, tried to fight for a system, a voluntary system that would get us better labels for American meat products. Wasn't entirely successful there. I did have to smile a little bit. Ronnie Jackson, who just recently won the former president's former physician who just ran a congressional primary in Texas, his big policy issue is country of origin labeling, as more and more meat packers are consolidating products, as more and more people are getting their meat products. More and more of our producers are struggling to make ends meet in spite of outrageously high over-the-counter grocery store meat prices. But this farm-to-table stuff should not be, I think, ignored in terms of kind of whether that goes broad-based. An interesting piece here, too, when you look at food waste, I would love to have a discussion about how much of that really exploded when people went to big box stores, where instead of picking up 2 peppers, you pick up 8 because they're all in a packet. Then you end up, thinking, what am I going to do with 8 peppers now that I have them at my house? I happen to really like peppers, so I'll figure out something to do with them. But I think that there is that if you look at packaging and you look at, where people are buying their groceries in larger and larger supermarkets, I think there's going to be a transition and a change to understanding, number one, where their food came from, but also more awareness, especially among millennials, on that food waste issue and how we're going to deal with that. Environmentally sensitive consumers, and there I'll show you a chart a little bit later on. It goes a little bit to what you saw in terms of agriculture's usage and carbon-based emissions from agriculture and what that means. One thing that I don't think we should underestimate is animal rights activists' role that they're going to play in the next Farm Bill. I know that for a lot of years, the PETA influence has been poo-pooed by a lot of people, including me, saying, look, this is the way we do it. It's the way you keep your food supply safe. I was struck by the fact that as there's been more and more criticism of meat food processors in the kind of economy today, whether it is the large confined hog operations now that are struggling with COVID, not where you don't have the supply chain that allows you to continue to move those animal units out of those grow units, and then you end up doing things that the rest of society may see as inhumane. And both Cory Booker, well-known vegan, great friend of mine, but obviously Anne Elizabeth Warren have kind of paired up with the folks who are really concerned about the heavy concentration of these industries into one or two, many of which are controlled by people who, by companies that are not American companies, and then adding to the fuel of all of this animal rights activists. And so I think you're going to see in the next Farm Bill an outsized role for animal rights activists, driven by maybe some newly found advocates within the Congress. And so again, thinking again about where we do this and where the majority of Congress is in terms of their percentages, especially in the House of Representatives, I think it's something that we have to be very, very concerned about. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so on America's diet and looking at the impact of COVID on agriculture, I don't think we can ignore this. About 40% of adults in the United States have one underlying health condition that puts them at risk for severe complications of COVID-19. That was just this report was just released last Thursday by CDC. When you look at chronic health problems such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, kidney disease, cardiovascular, they're known to be more prevalent among COVID-19 patients sick enough to be hospitalized. And then a study published in April found that among those hospitalized, 57% had high blood pressure, 41% were obese, and just a third had diabetes. And so the real challenge, it seems to me, is for us to take a look at the American diet. And if you look at again, great research being done by the Economic Research Service Center. It's just such a marvelous organization, completely reliable data. Take a look at what we consider baseline American diet compared to what we consider healthy. And again, sugar, sweets, and beverages, 3 times what we should be eating as healthy Americans. Huge fats, oils, and salad dressings. You know, that's the old thing, if I'm going to have a salad. But if you look at one of the great things I think that happened and people will disagree with me, but a great thing that happened with the healthcare law was this requirement that you put calories on your menu, especially if you're a national chain. All of a sudden people started realizing, man, when you're eating that salad, you might as well have a burger because the salad has more calories. That's all, you know, sugar and salad dressings again. Vegetables, healthy American should be eating twice as many vegetables as what we are, to almost twice as many fruits. Grain products, we do pretty well. But again, we have to look at what those grain products, you know, if they're whole grains. Seeds and nuts, eggs do pretty well, meat and poultry. You know, we're eating just a little bit more than what we should. Milk and milk products, not eating enough. And my friend Tom Vilsack, who's been very involved with the dairy industry, he would smile at this as I'm telling people to eat more milk and dairy products. But if you look at, again, this is something that's going to be a discussion as we transition again to the new Farm Bill, and as we look at what our expectations are for hot lunch programs, for WIC requirements, for the kind of food security piece of our I think a part of our food, you know, America's food consumption. What does that look like and how do you drive it? And we know that introducing different vegetables and fruits in schools and hot lunch programs can have a dramatic effect. We've seen it in some of the other programs that we've done, looking at America's hot lunch program. All of a sudden, if they cut up some vegetables, kids go home and tell their mom, man, I really like that kiwi. Can we have some of that? And the other big debate that's going to be had by the United States, and you saw some of this if you watched the presentation from Impossible, or from the food waste organization, Refeed, and that is taking a look at, to produce the kind of food that we need to produce, diet related, to eat in this country. How are we using resources? And you can see almost twice as much on greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this is from Economic Research Service at USDA. How many billion gallons of water? How many total acres of land? We're using more land than would be required if we were more efficient. Forest Service products is the only place where we are actually below. And so as agriculture gets the light, a big light on it, as a result of the event, you know, the lens of climate, these are going to be issues that are going to be raised and are going to be talked about. So if I could just transition to the last slide, which I'm a subscriber to an organization or to a magazine called Successful Farming. And I want you to realize that this was not a cover for their magazine after COVID. This was February's cover before COVID had hit our country. And I think that what they're signaling, and this is not, you know, some left-wing or terribly right-winged organization, what they're signaling is that we are in transition in agriculture. You know, we have had varying degrees of success back in the day when we used to grow a lot of wheat in our state. And we had the grain embargo, the wheat embargo with Russia, lost that market. Russia and other countries ran to fill the gap, and we lost the market. You know, I think we're going to be, I think we need to have a broader discussion about what does agriculture into the future look like, and how do we effectuate public policy to make that happen, and how significant is that to rural America. And so what I would say is that diversification of the rural economy to take the pressure off the outsized role that agriculture plays in the rural economy is essential. One of the great things from COVID, in my opinion, is that if you're a state like North Dakota that's invested heavily in broadband, what you will see is the opportunity for people to move home and work from home and do everything that they can to repopulate, to provide greater opportunities. I mean, I think people don't realize that Microsoft, the third largest plant that they have where they actually employ people in person, is actually in Fargo, North Dakota. And they're able to secure a workforce in part because we have proximity to the cities. Fargo is a growing community, much like Des Moines and a lot of the other kind of mid-sized urban centers. But there's no reason why that work can't be done in Carrington. No reason why it can't be done in Flasher if we have the infrastructure. And so a critical part of Plan B, I think, is not just to look at agriculture, but to look at where the synergies are for rural economies. On the dark side of this is actually what's happening in rural healthcare. If we are literally miles away from a woman being able to deliver a baby, and in some places in North Dakota, you're 60, 70 miles away from someone who will deliver your child. That's even more exacerbated in more sparsely populated rural areas. It's going to be very, very difficult to recruit young families to come and live in a place where they don't feel like healthcare can be delivered. I also say it's always hard to find a place where if it doesn't pass the Netflix test, if you can't stream Netflix, what does that look like? But I think it's important for the future of agriculture to give them a little breathing space kind of going into the future for not being the sole reason why people live in rural America. The other thing that I would say is as we look at more and more of our plant-based proteins, the transition, I'm seeing more and more peas in North Dakota. They're a little fussier to grow, but I think farmers are going to have to think about how they're going to transition, whether it's growing organics and getting a plus up in the market. We actually are a big grower of chickpeas. A lot of people don't realize that, and we have a great processing facility in Dickinson, North Dakota, actually Richardson, North Dakota, that ships chickpeas all over the world. And so I got a question. I'm going to transition to some of your questions now. California's Central Valley produces a fourth of all the nation's food, including 40% of fruits, nuts, and other table foods with an estimated value of $17 billion per year. Why does it appear that California farmers receive less money from the government? That's a great question. And if I were a California congressman, I would ask that all the time. When you look at the farm program, certainly Title I and the crop insurance program, which are huge drivers of the expenditures of crop CREP dollars, farm bill dollars, they're heavily focused on grains, heavily focused on cotton, peanuts, places where people like me serve on the Ag Committee, because that's critically important to our industry, and as important as agriculture is to California, they have never played a big role in the drafting of the Farm Bill. Again, that's something that I think we're going to see change, and that puts many of the agricultural, back to my argument that the political clout may in fact be waning. And, you know, if you can forgive me one partisan statement, I think the Democratic Party, which has found very few friends in the center of the country, needs to kind of re-examine their relationship to rural America. That's why it's one of the prime things that I've been doing since I left the Senate. But I also think that American agriculture, if they become single party voters, are running a great deal of risk that that support and that support that they receive in the Farm Bill, and that the outsized dollars that come to them in the Farm Bill will in fact will not see the same level of experience, and if it does, it will come with consequences. And by that I mean, you know, additional conservation, soil conservation requirements in order to qualify, whether that's no-till or whether that's looking at minimum till. I mean, I think that the heyday of the middle of the country writing the Farm Bill by creating an alliance and alliance with the southern growers, whether it's cotton or peanuts or rice, I think that's done, and I think it's going to be a much bigger expansion of moving the country forward to a broader kind of food security policy. So I think that when you look at COVID, which was the kind of discussion that I was asked to have, I look at it as just yet another obstacle for rural America, another challenge for rural America, but also another opportunity, whether it is in, you know, growing a different kind of food, more food to table kind of awareness. You know, what is it that we could market from the Red River Valley into the Minneapolis market every day? What's happening right now with growing vegetables in containers? What does that look like? Some of that movement, you know, you're talking about impossible foods, but there's been some really interesting work being done on hydroponics and what that looks like in terms of growing fruits and vegetables in places like North Dakota that would otherwise be grown in California, with the argument being that when you reduce transportation and refrigeration costs, you actually are doing a tremendous service on greenhouse gases. The other thing that I anticipate will be a big discussion in the next Farm Bill is going to be moving forward with carbon sequestration as part of the opportunity that we have to, I think, participate in part of the solutions for climate in rural America, but also use that land mass that we have to evolve agriculture to be more responsive to the concerns of climate. You know, just for those of you who think that everybody in rural America is cynical about climate and climate change, polls done by our rural electric co-op consistently show that 65% of North Dakotans, you know, and understand North Dakota is a huge producer of fossil fuel energy, believe that climate is not a hoax. We did some polling. By we, I mean One Country, which is a group that I started, 401c4 group, 301, anyway, 301c4 group that paired with Third Way, which is a moderate kind of Democratic organization. And we did polling many rural states and rural parts of larger states like Michigan and Wisconsin, again, found very much a concern about what's happening with climate, what's happening as they see what's going on around them, maybe not believing that really broad-based solutions like the Green New Deal are the path forward, but they want to see opportunities to curb CO2 emissions, but also do them in a way that's not completely disruptive of the rural economy. And so agriculture is going to play a role, it seems to me, in the rural economy. It's going to play in climate and how we address climate. And I think agriculture is going to have a real discussion within itself on understanding the 21st century food consumer and how do we grow to address the concerns and the desires of that food consumer. So, I don't know, Jack.
Senator, thank you so much. I'm just fascinated by the observation that agriculture has always been, to a great degree, and continues to be, a reflection on the major shifts going on within America more broadly. And the idea that even the discussion yesterday and this morning about extension of COVID relief programs really illustrates the pressures that agriculture is under, and that the friends that they've had in certain areas are not necessarily as supportive as might have been in the past. So thank you so much for your exceptional comments and also your willingness to go out a little on the limb in forecasting some of the shifts and changes that are going on in our industry.
Yeah, I thank you so much for the opportunity. It's become a real passion for me, which is, look, we don't have the luxury in rural America and within the industry that I love, which is agriculture. We don't have the luxury to simply sit back and say, we're feeding the world and we're going to keep growing corn and soybeans and we're going to keep doing these things. We have to have the flexibility. And the commodity groups, I think, are getting to understand that we have to be looking at working with people who formulate processed food to make sure that that processed food is meeting nutritional demands and is actually leading the way to improve the quality of American diet. We can play a role in that instead of being the cause, as people see it, of a declining American diet. We can be a leader in agriculture in addressing that diet through plant-based proteins, chickpeas, whatever it is, by doing these transitions. And that the industry that I really enjoyed working with was the pulse industry. Peas and lentils and beans and their push for better nutritional standards. I think we just have to not think that we can keep doing what we've always done and be successful on the farm. We just as you saw those increases in productivity, we have to continue the increase that we have in making sure that our economy, or that our food security and the quality of the food that we eat is part of what we do in agriculture.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, and to everybody who has participated as attendees. Thank you. We're very grateful that you signed up, that you had asked really great questions, clearly very engaged in this really interesting topic. A couple of final notes. One, remember, if you need CLE credit, we've called out the codes and the like. You should print out and send the attendance form that was included in the reminder yesterday and send that to Michelle Hubble. If you were unable to ask, or we didn't get to any questions today, although I think we did a good job of that, please reach out to your Dorsey contact or one of the panelist presenters, and we'd be delighted to answer whatever questions you may have. Likewise, if you'd like a copy of the materials or Senator Heitkamp's presentation, just email me at droke.michael@dorsey.com, and I'd be happy to send you an additional copy if you have trouble tracking that down. And then finally, but most importantly, I really want to express my real gratitude to each of the panelists and presenters today. You each did a really fantastic job and making our first virtual and third annual Food Summit a success. So thank you, and to everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.